Hello, gentle listeners, and welcome to another episode of Hex Radio, the only radio station that's 100% guaranteed to be run by the haunted and magical. I am Echo, the Hex Maniac who runs Hex Radio, finally back from a long and unexpected break. Various things have happened since last I spoke to you, my dear listeners. I had the flu, the roof of the tower needed to be repaired, and a Shinigami needed to be contacted in order to escort out some particularly rowdy ghosts. It's been quite the eventful couple of months, which unfortunately left me with little time to sit down and spend some quality time with you, my gentle listeners. If all goes according to my hopes, however, my time away from you in the future will be very brief. Moving on, the subject of today's discussion shall be, upon request of my darling twin brother, the Dullahan. The Dullahan is another fairy of Irish lore, and might be the most familiar to you, thanks to classics like The Legend of Sleepy Hollow and more contemporary sources such as Durarara. Most well known as a headless rider, normally of a horse with their head tucked under their arm. They are a harbinger of death. It is said that by merely speaking the name of someone, they could cause them to drop dead right then and there, and that also, when they stopped riding, it would cause someone to die as well. Unlike the usual story of the Headless Horseman, the Dullahan tended to have a carriage as well. This carriage would be covered in either dried human skin or funeral shrouds, with wheel spokes made of thigh bones, skulls covered in candles, and other morbid adornments such as those usually used in funerals. Quite the frightening creature, don't you think? I'm aware that this has been a very short subject, but that's due to the fact that I'll be reading two stories from the Outer Banks Mysteries and Seaside Stories book that I picked up last time we spoke from the local library. And now, without further ado, our stories. The Grey Man of Hatteras. The year was 1966, and it was just 4 days until Labor Day. The Coast Guard of Cape Hatteras was busy with one of its assigned chores, warning the summer visitors as well as the year-round residents of the approach of that year's big hurricane. It was certain that the big wind was expected to pass directly over Cape Hatteras, and the word was either to get out while there was time, or else to get to a place of safety with all deliberate speed. Already the wind was blowing a full gale, and the mist and spume from the sea rolled over the beaches as Apprentice Seaman Brooks, newly out of the boot camp at the Coast Guard Academy, led his detachment of men along the beach near Cape Point. They had just visited the last cottage near the beach, and their work was complete. They were walking back to the spot where they had parked their beach vehicle. Then they saw it. There, standing just in the break of the seaward dunes, was the figure of a human wearing a southwester and slowly swinging his right arm as though to motion someone to come back from the beach and seek the shelter of the dunes. All but one of the men in the party knew immediately what they were seeing. That one, an outlander recently assigned to service on the Outer Banks, ran toward the shadowy figure, shouting a warning as he ran. The figure turned and faced the runner until barely 10 feet separated them. Then it vanished. It just disappeared into thin air. If it was a human, there was no place for him to have hidden. There were no footprints where he had been standing. A search of the nearby beach produced nothing, and the newcomer began to doubt his own eyesight. When he returned to his group, they explained to the newcomer as gently as they could that what had been seen was not a human, but was the familiar Grey Man of Hatteras. Since the early 1900s, the Grey Man has appeared on that stretch of beach between Cape Point and the Hatteras Lighthouse every time a hurricane threatens. He always appears to be trying to warn the residents to take shelter from the approaching storm, and he always walks that particular stretch of beach. Some of the old-timers will tell you that this is the spirit of a man who was actually named Grey, and who lived near Cape Point in the late 1800s. He had drowned in a late, sudden, and unexpected storm on that beach. They say he never fails to give his warning, and he's never wrong about the coming storm. He's just as dependable as a barometer. He is known as a friend and has nothing at all to be afraid of. He loves his people and he wants to protect them from harm. Although she's not old enough to remember Grey when he was alive, Mrs. Jean Austen of Hatteras Village has heard Guardsman Brooks tell of that apparition many times. So has Miss May Austen of the same village. He was one of us in life, and he is one of us still, is the way most people think of him. The Affair at Brownrigg Mill. Interest in witchcraft, the exorcism of evil spirits, and the occult in general is nothing new. Mankind has long been fascinated by, and deathly afraid of, witchcraft. The early history of our country is dotted with accounts of people who were suspected of being witches or warlocks, and of the court trials of those unfortunates by their superstitious peers. It is thought that the colonial preoccupation with witchcraft began in 1962 with the hysteria of the famous witch trials in Salem, Massachusetts, and then spread elsewhere. In those days, there was a very large and well-established trade route by sea between all New England and the Albemarle section of North Carolina, especially the principal port of Edenton, better known then as the port of Roanoke. It was probably through this commercial and social intercourse that the people of eastern North Carolina became acquainted with the superstitions and horrors of witchcraft. Although there were in North Carolina, as elsewhere, special laws against witchcraft and its practice, most historians do not believe that Tar Heels ever went to the lengths of their fellow colonists in persecuting those thought to be witches. The historian Francis Lister Hawkes states the opinion that no one was ever tortured to death for witchcraft in North Carolina. John Lawson, North Carolina's first Surveyor General and historian par excellence, wrote that the only executions he had heard of in North Carolina during this period were a Turk who was convicted of murder and an old woman who was tried and convicted for witchcraft. In the General Court of Oyer and Termenter in the year 1697, an indictment was brought against Susanna Evans of Currituck Precinct, which reads, "She did, on or about July 25th, last past, devilishly and maliciously bewitch, and by the assistance of the devil inflict with mortal pains the body of Deborah Bonthier, whereby the said Deborah departed this life, and also did diabolically and maliciously bewitch several others," and a shining example of the good sense of the common folk of North Carolina, The grand jury which received that indictment returned it to the court on the same day, with the word ignoramus written across the face of the bill. Susanna Evans was discharged by the court and went her way, a free woman. It is privately reported, however, that from that day some people walked a rather wide circle around Susanna whenever they met her on the road. As early as 1710, a woman in Chowan County brought a lawsuit against another woman for saying, "You are a witch, and I can prove it." Apparently the defendant could not prove it, for the court found for the plaintiff in the sum of £200 sterling for damage to fame and reputation. Thus, while there were no recorded wave of hysteria in witch hunting in the Old North State, as contrasted with some of the other colonies, there persisted a fear of the unknown, and a desire to have no part of such occult goings-on, if, indeed, they really did exist. There is one story of witchcraft, however, that is so well documented and established that it has been told by grandfather to grandson for a good 200 years. To begin with, the location of the story, Brownrigg Mill, really did exist. A part of it is still standing today for the curious to examine as they wish. The mill is located in Chowan County, just 12 miles north of the ancient town of Eddington. It was built in 1762 by Richard Brownrigg, who resided at Wingfield. In the Chowan County Courthouse in Edenton, there is recorded the order of court permitting Brownrigg to build this mill. It is found in the minutes of the July term, 1762, and reads, in part, as follows: "The petition of Richard Brownrigg, Esquire, for building a mill on Indian Creek, granted. The land on one side belonging to the petitioner, and on the other to William Boyd, Esquire, who, being present in court, agreed that the said mill might be built, and at the same time agreed that 1 acre of his land should be set apart for that purpose, for the use of the said Richard Brownrigg." Richard Brownrigg built his mill well. It stood in active use for almost 2 centuries, serving mankind with regular operation and with a dependability seldom matched. Generation after generation of people in eastern North Carolina have known and loved that mill, in later years sometimes called Dillard Mill, and they have been nourished by the fine, white meal it produced for their tables. The old mill, in its busy days, consisted of a sawmill and a cotton gin at one end of the dam across Indian Creek. On the other end of that dam were the corn and flour mills. The large millstones used in grinding the grain were especially quarried and honed at Asopus on the Hudson River. To the north of the mill, in a beautiful shady grove of trees, stood the miller's cottage. It made quite a picture in the days when the mill was in operation. The wide, mysterious mill pond was rimmed on the far side by cypress trees, ancient even then, whose dark shade lent an air of foreboding to that end of the pond, and contrasted sharply with the cozy little cottage nestled in its grove at the other end. This, then, was the scene during those years immediately preceding the American Revolution, when the mill was operated by a young widower named Tim Farrow. Tim had loved his wife with all his heart, and when she died, leaving him with a very young daughter to care for and raise all by himself, he was distraught. He loved his little girl, and he spent as much time with her as he possibly could, trying to be both father and mother to her. He did a passably good job at it, too, as the child blossomed and grew and began to take over some of the household chores. Yet, in spite of their love, it was always lonely in that picturesque cottage with just the two of them. In addition to being an expert miller, Farrow was also adept at the many other skills necessary to civilized living in those colonial days. He was an expert lumberjack, and he kept not only his own woodshed filled with prime firewood for the winters, but those of some of his nearer neighbors also. He owned a double-bitted woodsman's axe of which he was very proud, and which he kept honed to razor sharpness. He made the woodsman's claim that the firewood he cut would warn him twice, once when he cut it, and again when he burned it in the large fireplace in his cottage. The magnificent silver-colored axe was kept in the mill on a shelf over the area in which he stored the corn. In those days it was the custom of Tim Farrow, when his work was all caught up in the afternoons, when the mill was secured and the sun was beginning to sink behind the huge mill pond, to spend an hour or two fishing in the deep water adjacent to the mill dam. Fine perch and catfish abounded in those depths. Not only was it a pleasant pastime for him, but it also frequently provided a delicious and nourishing supper for when his lovely daughter cooked up the fish just as he liked them. As he fished, his eyes would often stray to the remote woods on the other side of the mill pond. These were deep woods where few people had ever been, and they always seemed to Tim to have an ominous air. One hot midsummer afternoon, just as the afternoon haze was turning into dusk, Tim was preparing to end his fishing for the day. As he wound up his lines, he looked far across the pond and beheld a canoe gliding gracefully out of the forest shadows and onto the glassy surface of the pond. The figure of the canoeist was that of a woman whom Tim took to be elderly, since she was dressed in a long-sleeved calico dress and wore a deep poke bonnet pulled forward so that it hid her face completely. Filled with curiosity as to what sort of elderly woman would be emerging from that dark and mysterious place, Tim waited on the dam and watched the small craft approach, heading directly for him. As the bow of the canoe touched the dam, Tim reached down to help its occupant up and onto the walkway. At that instant, he realized to his amazement that the traveler was not an old woman, but the most beautiful young woman he had ever seen in his life. Her hair, when she took off her poke bonnet, proved to be a lustrous, shiny jet black, and the cheeks the bonnet had shaded were peach pink. Her eyes were a deep shade of emerald green and sparkled with life and vitality. She leaped with grace from the canoe to the top of the dam, holding on to Tim's sweaty palm all the while. When she thanked him for his help, her voice proved to be deep and throaty. Tim was altogether smitten with the lovely and totally unexpected apparition. When she asked for food and lodging for the night, the fascinated miller immediately agreed. Travel by water was much more common in those days than travel by the uncertain roads, and it was more or less expected that rural householders would put up such a traveler for the night as an act of common courtesy. Well, the upshot of that meeting was that Tim fell desperately in love with the beautiful stranger. She spent that night in the spare room at Tim's cottage, and the next day moved to the home of a nearby widow lady to spend a few days before continuing her travels. But Tim had seen his beauty by candlelight and across his rude dining table. He had seen how tenderly she looked at his daughter, and how the two seemed to hit it off right from the start. He came to realize how much grace and charm she added to his home, and how much a woman's touch could mean to his orphaned daughter. Before the day of her scheduled departure, Tim had paid his court to the beautiful, mysterious lady, and had been accepted. The two were married the next time a visiting preacher from Eddington visited the neighborhood. The two were married the next time a visiting preacher from Eddington visited the neighborhood. After the wedding, the two settled down at the miller's cottage near the mill. Tim was ecstatically happy. His new wife and his daughter soon became fast friends, and the young bride introduced them to a whole new world of ways they had never heard of before. She cooked strange and delicious dishes for them, and seasoned the old and familiar ones with spices and herbs she bought from traveling peddlers. She used the fine meal Tim brought from the mill as it had never been used before, and her accomplishments soon earned her quite a bit of fame and jealousy among the neighboring wives. At night, round the hearth fire, she would tell wonderful tales and stories that sent cold shivers along Tim's spine. She spoke of ancient Egypt and its pharaohs as though she had actually been present in those Old Testament times. She was, indeed, an extraordinary person, and Tim's happiness knew no bounds. Then things began to change. As the weeks wore on into months, the neighboring housewives began to talk about her. They would say she was a strange one, and no one really knew who she was or where she came from anyway. Then what seemed to be a noticeable pattern of retribution sprang up. The livestock of those families who had been most open in their criticism of Tim's new wife began to sicken and die from strange and unexplained causes. When some of these women persisted in voicing their suspicions, members of their families became ill and died as though an epidemic had stricken the countryside. The doctors were unable to diagnose or cure these strange illnesses, and a quiet terror began to grip the community. They began to call her a witch. It was remembered that she had been seen walking down the lane past the pasture the very week before one farmer's cow had mysteriously died. In another family, the grandmother had suddenly contracted an unknown illness and had lingered for days, delirious and speaking in tongues, before she died despite the doctor's efforts to save her. In her delirium, she spoke several times about that strange lady stopping in front of the house and adjusting her bonnet, all the while staring fixedly into the front door. These and other misfortunes were all laid at the door of the newcomer, and it was pointed out that only the people who had been the most critical of her were the ones visited with disaster. People were frightened. They were up against something their doctors did not seem to know how to cope with, and they felt defenseless. No one knew who would be next. The widow lady with whom the pretty traveler had stayed while Tim was courting her recalled that, on several occasions during those few days, she had gone into the girl's room to clean up, and had found the huge feather bed undisturbed except for one large round spot in the middle of the bedspread, just as though a large cat had slept there. Some of the men even went to Tim at his mill and complained of the situation. The bolder ones even demanded that the woman be sent away from the community. Tim just laughed and called them superstitious fools. He indignantly refused the pleas to have the preacher try to exorcise the evil spirit the next time he visited. He most certainly would not put his wife through such a humiliating experience, even if the preacher would agree to try to do such a thing. Time continued to wear on, and the situation did not get any better. For Tim, it got much worse. He grew angry with the people who were calling his wife a witch, and he told them so in no uncertain terms. They, in turn, grew angry with him, and many began to take their grain to another mill, even though it was farther away, and did not grind as fine a meal as did Tim's. Then things began to go wrong at the mill. The young miller would open the mill in the morning and find that the sacks of grain he had stored so carefully for the next day's work had been split open and the grain scattered about the mill house floor. On other occasions he would find that the sluice gates in the dam had been opened so that the dam wasted water, when he distinctly remembered closing the gates the night before. In the hopper that fed the grain into the grinding wheels, he began to find nails that had sifted down between the stones, and caused them to buck and tremble and spit sparks at him, and to grind unevenly, thus producing an inferior meal. The bare grass thongs with which he bound the tops of the meal bags were found scattered about the floor, and some of them were thrown into the mill race, even though Tim was always very careful to keep them sorted and in place, ready for use. Tim concluded that some of his neighbors and former customers were trying to ruin him, to drive him into bankruptcy, and thus out of the community. He told his wife that he intended to lie in wait for them. He wanted to catch them in their meanness and give them a good whipping to teach them a lesson. Some people were continuing to bring him their custom, but business was badly off, and he said he needed to put a stop to all the neighborhood foolishness once and for all. He felt he must clear up the situation if his business were to survive. Worst of all, Farrow was now convinced that his young wife had grown tired of him, and did not love him any more. She seemed dispirited and distracted most of the time, and she would stare at him through narrowed lids with those haunting green eyes. He felt a terrible sense of anxiety and fear, as though some awful doom portended for him or for the whole community. He tried his best to dismiss this feeling by blaming it on the conduct of his neighbors, but the feeling of an unknown dread remained just the same. He felt threatened, terribly threatened, and he did not know by what or whom. For a full week Tim sat up every night at his mill, but nothing at all happened. No bags were ripped open, no bare grass thongs were disturbed, and the mill remained just as it was. Farrow was completely baffled. How could they have known he would be lying in wait for them? Maybe the persecutions that ended. Maybe his neighbors were now going to leave him alone. He gave up his nightly vigils and began to spend those nights at home. It was about 3 days after he had given up his watch when a tremendous thunderstorm began to build up in the western sky. Obviously, it was going to be a very stormy night, not fit weather for man nor beast. But Tim saw it as a golden opportunity. Now, he thought, if they are ever to come back, this is the night. They will be sure that I will not venture out in this coming storm, and, if they mean me ill, they will try their mischief tonight. So, just as darkness fell and the storm approached, Tim told his wife that he was going to the store, and that he would not be back until quite late. But when he left the cottage, he went to the mill. There he hid himself among some bags of meal he had ground the day before, and there he lay in ambush for the people who had been tormenting him. Soon after he had ensconced himself, the storm broke with all its fury. The lightning flashed brilliantly, and the thunder rolled and crashed ponderously and magnificently. The mill shook with the reverberations of the squall, and for a moment Tim had fearful thoughts for his dam and its safety. He could not remember whether he had opened the spillway gates to take the pressure of all this extra water off the dam. However, the storm soon abated temporarily, and the moon broke briefly through the driving clouds. At that precise time a hoot owl alighted on the roof of the mill and gave an ear-splitting scream that almost startled Tim out of his wits. He jumped so vigorously that he knocked over one of the concealing bags of meal and had to rehide himself. Just then he heard a muffled, pounding roar coming closer and closer, and he half raised himself from his squatting position in anticipation of attack before he realized it was a farmer's wagon rattling over the mill race bridge in a late evening effort to get home before the second storm broke over the countryside. Then, and just as suddenly, he heard a horrible cacophony as though all the frogs in the world had suddenly let loose with their best notes. There were frogs of all sizes, apparently, and notes of all ranges and volumes. A veritable full symphony of frog noises that were ear-splitting. With a shock, Tim realized that he had never heard that many frogs in all his life, and he remembered that, in the folklore of his time, frogs were always associated with witches and demons of all sorts. As the amphibian tumult continued, the mill house began to be invaded with lightning bugs, the biggest and the brightest that Tim could ever remember seeing. They came in scores and in hundreds, lighting up the interior of the mill house with an eerie half-light that, with the frog noises, lent an air of otherworldliness to the little mill. To the northwest, the thunderous grumble of the approaching second half of the big storm could be heard. The young miller began to regret that he had ever come to the mill. Almost anything would have been better than this awful experience. And then he heard it. There came a deafening drum-fire series of blows upon the front door of the mill. It sounded as though 100 broomsticks had begun to beat upon the door, demanding admittance. Faster and faster the beat rolled on, and louder and more imperative was the demand for entrance. The frog noises seemed to redouble. Then, with a deafening roar of thunder, the skies seemed to open, and a deluge of rain began to pour upon the little mill. In stark terror, Tim braced himself for whatever was to come. The battered front door burst open with a bang, and in flew 50 or 60 of the biggest cats anyone has ever seen. Their fangs were bared as though in great anger, and fire seemed to flash from their green eyes. As though on signal, they began to circle Farrow at full speed, howling and spitting and glaring at him. Every once in a while, one would break from the narrowing circle surrounding the terrified miller and would strike at him with extended claws, sometimes inflicting deep cuts on his face, at other times ripping his clothing. Young Farrow had expected nothing like this. He could not fight the enraged cats with his bare hands, and yet he must do something or he would be dead, and that in a very few minutes. Already he was beginning to feel weak from loss of blood. You can't fight wild cats with a bag of meal, and Tim had provided himself with no weapon. Glancing up in desperation, the young man beheld his trusty double-bitted axe with the razor-sharp blades. The handle was just protruding over the edge of the overhead shelf. Grasping that axe in determination, at least to defend himself, he once again faced the cats going around and around with such speed now as to make him dizzy. With a tremendous effort, Tim took aim at the biggest and wildest-looking cat in the attacking horde, and he swung his axe with all his might and with a strength born of desperation. His aim was true. The sharp axe completely severed the right front paw of the huge cat. The severed foot fell into the hopper at Tim's side, and the axe, on the tremendous follow-through of the swing, embedded itself deeply into one of the supporting timbers that held up the roof of the mill. With a howl of pain and rage, the huge cat burst through the back door of the mill and, with its legs spurting blood, ran along the top of the dam in the pouring rain. All the other cats, with howls and screams, followed the injured beast along the dam. Although weaponless once again, Tim ran after the feline horde, but he stumbled and fell, and the cats vanished into the darkness and the storm. Tim then ran back through the mill and up the path to his little cottage. Upon bursting into his bedroom door, he found his wife, with her jet-black hair and her beautiful green eyes, laying upon the bed, her right hand cut off at the wrist and blood staining the coverlet of the bed. In horror, Tim looked as she turned once again into a huge black cat, and, spitting defiance at him, leaped down from the bed and limped out through the open door. Tim's thoughts flashed once again to his beloved mill. Running back in desperation to open the gates before water pressure broke the dam, he was about halfway across the dam itself when the threatened structure gave way. At least 100 feet of that dam washed out with a thunderous roar, and Tim went with it. A search party recovered his body the next day several 100 feet downstream, and they all wondered at the look of terror on his handsome young face. The dam was restored after that, and the mill was put back into operation, but they say you can still see the section that was washed out under the huge pressure of the storm, and who knows what else. The survivors? Well, Tim's young daughter was taken by an aunt who lived in Eatington, and although it was a long time before she recovered completely from the shock of that last night, she eventually grew into a lovely and talented young woman, and made a good marriage with the son of one of the old families in that colonial town. Her descendants live there to this day, but they shall remain nameless in this account for obvious reasons. As we saw, the mill was reactivated, the dam was repaired, and a new miller was obtained to run the business. No more mishaps or pranks occurred, although several years later a large black three-legged cat showed up at the mill. It would look the miller in the eye with its large, beautiful green eyes, and would purr with contentment when the miller noticed it. The new miller did not like the cat, however, and he did all he could to discourage it from staying at the mill. He was just not one of those people who like cats, and besides, he'd heard the story of poor Tim Farrow many times, and he did not believe in taking chances. When all his rebuffs to the cat did not work, and the feline kept hanging around, he knew he had to take decisive steps to remove the threat of a repetition of the Tim Farrow story. The miller had a fine muzzle-loading shotgun, of which he was very proud, and with which he was very skilled. He loaded the barrel of the gun with silver money, dimes and half-dimes, putting an extra-large charge of powder behind the load. Taking dead aim at the large cat sunning itself on the dam runway, he fired away and scored a direct hit with at least a portion of the silver. With a scream of rage and pain, the cat leaped up and ran off into the forest, apparently none the worse for the shot, but finally convinced that it was not wanted thereabouts. So far has been reported, it has not since been seen in that vicinity. Well, unlike the first time I read from that book, it seems as if these last two stories have actually fit with our theme of horror and the occult, at least with ghosts and witches. Unfortunately, I do need to return this book to the library, so that will likely be the last time I read from it. And now for our spell. I know that I myself am currently in need of some extra finances due to all of the things that have been happening these last couple of months, and I can only assume that others might need the help as well. So what we'll do tonight is a spell to draw in luck and money. This is a bit of a project, so you'll need a few items. A glass mason jar with a lid and a green candle. Traditionally, you would use a taper or a pillar candle, but if you can find a green tea light or a green votive candle, then those will not only work just as well, but will save you a good deal of trouble later on down the line. Step 1 to your spell is to go out to a place such as a mall where a lot of money changes hands and look for pennies. You want to collect 13 pennies on heads. Mind you, you definitely want to go to a place where people are eagerly spending money and people are eagerly making money. If you find any pennies on tails, flip them so someone else can have that luck, and then continue on your search until you've collected all 13. Once you have all 13 of them, put them in a jar and begin to fill it with herbs such as thyme and basil, spices like cinnamon and clove, perhaps a rock taken from outside of a shop, or sand from a popular beach. The spell itself should be cast on the night of a full moon, outside beneath the light. You'll fill the final space in the jar with clear, filtered water, then seal it tightly, and then light the candle and set it on top of the jar. And now you have to wait for the candle to burn all the way down. As it burns, fill your mind with happy thoughts. You don't want to let any negativity sneak into your jar. Afterwards, you should store the jar somewhere safe to let the spell do its work. If you have any suggestions or questions for future episodes, you can always tell your nearest dark corner. You know the one. The darkest corner of a room that somehow never manages to see the light of day. Just whisper your question into the darkness, and it'll find its way to me. I would like to take this time to personally thank my patrons, Marco Marino, Ian Sprecher, Jojo Binks, and Mr. Bevins. The 4 of you have been such a help to me, and I truly appreciate it. That said, I would also like to thank all of my gentle listeners for tuning in. Thank you, and happy hauntings.